Once you understand prorations, it actually becomes more simple for you to at least get the process. So what we're showing you here is just one more thing that we could prorate. There are other things out there that might be prorated as well, like the homeowners association, for example. But at the end of the day, you're going to do them all roughly the same way. You figure out the period, you divide it, and you figure out who owes what. In this case, rent is very, very simple from the standpoint that rent is always a calendar month proration. So it doesn't really matter what month it's going to be. It's going to start on the first of the month and it's going to end on the 30th of the month because our class has 30-day months. So here's the deal in this particular case. The rent for this particular month was $1,200. Now, for our purposes, for our class, we're to assume that the rent was paid on time and that money is in the seller's pocket. Here's why that's important. Rent is always paid in advance. So if the buyer paid on time, they've already paid for, in my example here, for the month of January or for this particular month. They don't necessarily have to give it a name. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the $1,200 and divide it by 30 days in a month to determine that realistically the rent is worth $40 per day. Okay. Well, here's the problem with that. The seller actually has the whole month of rent in his pocket, but he doesn't own it the whole time. So the question is, what would be fair? And what would be fair in this particular case? So you can see in this case, the $1,200 a month rent divided by 30, because there's 30 days in the month, is $40 per day. Now, while that is an interesting number, keep in mind the seller has the whole month, the whole $1,200 in his pocket. Well, that doesn't seem fair. The buyer is going to own it for part of the month. So it seems like it would be fair if the buyer were to receive the rent for the days that he owns the property in this month. So at closing, what we're going to do is we're going to do an adjustment. There's 30 days in the month. It's closing on the 14th. So while the seller is going to keep the 14 days, the 16 days of rent, and keep in mind on this one, there is no +1 or anything like that. The seller gets to keep the day of closing in this case. So the buyer is not involved in the day of closing. And so what the buyer will get are the 16 days at the end of the month times $40 per day, $640. And if you say, well, where's that money going to come from? Well, we're going to debit it from the seller. Why? Well, the seller already has the rent for the month. So we're going to take it from the seller and we're going to give the exact same amount, 640, to the buyer. Okay. Question number 2. I told you we're not going to do a lot of tricks to you. Having said that, this next one you could consider to be a trick. We're closing on the 24th. However, what we're selling is a duplex. So when you look at a duplex, you say, well, where do I start this problem? Tell you where I'd start. I would start by simply saying 800 times 2. There was actually $1,600 in rent collected. After you get that, and again, that's the closest we come to a trick in these. After you do that, the problem is the same as the previous one. $1,600 per month, which is already in the seller's pocket. We're going to divide by 30 because rent is a calendar month proration. This one's going to come out to be a little bit wonky because it's not going to be evenly divisible by 30. Let's see, 1,600 divided by 30, 53, and then of course repeating threes per day. And then we say, well, how many days does the buyer get? Well, the buyer is going to own the days after the 24th. And there are 6 days after the 24th. So buyer, you're entitled to 6 days at $53.33 per day. I have that comes out to $320. You say, well, where's the buyer going to get the money from? Well, we're going to take it from the seller. Debit seller, credit buyer, same amount. Whatever we take from the seller is in fact what we give to the buyer. By this point, you probably have these figured out, but for your homework, you had one more. So let me give you that one so that you will have a full complement of these problems. We'll go through it fairly quickly because you've seen a couple of them now. Rent is $22.50. Again, let me remind you, be careful. I almost wrote down 2,500 when I was doing that, but it's actually 22.50. Divided by 30, because it's a calendar month proration. And again, because I'm getting a little bit tired, I almost made a mistake, said 360, not remembering, of course, that it was a rent proration. So it's only a $30 month, 30-day month. So let me do this. Let's see, 30 days times $75 a day is in fact $22.50. Okay, so $75 per day. And then we look to see it's closing on the 10th. Very tempting to just simply say, oh, okay, well, how about 10 times 75? Well, nope, that's not right. It's 20. Okay, so 20 days that the buyer is entitled to times $75 per day. And that looks like it's going to come out to be $1,500. Debit seller, credit buyer. And all you're doing on the settlement statement is making sure that the rent was taken care of and that the attorney put this in the correct column. The attorneys have calculators that are going to handle all of this. They're going to plug it into a computer. The computer is likely not going to make a mathematical mistake. We know this just so that we can kind of double check to make sure that everything was accounted for. Rent prorations.